Welcome to this presentation of the entire story of the Bible in 50 minutes, which I must be honest is quite a pretentious sort of a title, but there is some sort of reasoning behind it. I've been a pastor for nearly 20 years, and the churches that I've pastored, I've noticed, have got godly people in them who know bits of the Bible, who know some of the stories and can quote some of the texts. But I did find that people needed to have some sort of big picture. And so this presentation originated as a Sunday morning sermon, and it's sort of grown over the years. So our purposes are these. We want, as we look through this material, to get the big picture of what's contained in the Bible. I want you to be able to connect up the bits that you already know into a narrative, but I want you to get excited as well about knowing the Bible better, and, because I want a decision, I want you to decide that you're going to do this to get to know the Scriptures better than you do. So let's get a very short overview, the Bible in 50 words. God made, Adam bit, Noah arced, Abraham split, Joseph ruled, Jacob fooled, Bush talked, Moses balked, Pharaoh plagued, people walked, sea divided, tablets guided, promise landed, Saul freaked, David peaked, prophets warned, Jesus born, God walked, love talked, anger crucified, hope died, spirit flamed, word spread, God remained. Well, we could stop there, but let's try and add a little bit of flesh to this. You may be aware that the Bible is a library of books with different authors over quite a considerable period of time. We, within the Christian church, refer to the Old Testament, though our Jewish friends would refer to their scriptures as the Tanakh. A testament is an agreement, so this in the Old Testament is the former agreement between God and his people. It covers the giving of the law, the writings and the prophetic, and God's dealings with his people before Jesus, 39 Old Testament books. Then the New Testament talks about the coming of Jesus, the spreading of the good news about him. This tells us of the life and teaching of Jesus, tells us about the first church, some letters to the early church, and the future 27 books. What we're going to do to understand this overview of the story of the Bible is to look at a succession of chapters of God's activity for his people. So to understand how we're going to do that, let's think about you. If we were to have a timeline, you'd find that you were somewhere way over to the right-hand end of this timeline. If we think about who key people are in the church today, well, God's people, wherever you may be. Which Bible books do you feature in? Well, you're anticipated in many of them. We think as well, as we go through the story of the Bible, whose rule? At the time of recording this, we are under the rule of Gordon Brown. Then, to help understand each chapter, we'll produce a map. And in case you're not quite sure where the UK is, it's sort of in the top left there, which gives us a foundation now to be able to look at the first of these chapters, which is the chapter of beginnings. This would be a long time ago. The Bible book which tells the beginnings is Genesis, that's what the name means. Key people in the story, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel and Noah. And the story begins in the bottom right-hand corner of our map in the sort of Iraq-Iran sort of an area. So the story is this. God creates the world, light, sky, waters, land, vegetation, seasons, sea life, birds, animals, and then human beings, Adam and Eve. The Bible story tells us that people, Adam and Eve, mess up what God has given to them, and hard work, frustration, and murder, when Cain kills Abel, enter into human experience. God brings a flood in which all but Noah's family on the ark are killed. God promises that this is not going to happen again. And as we trace through the story of the Bible, we're going to find a sequence of God's promises that are made to his people. This first promise comes with the sign of a rainbow. And we're going to look at a series of covenants. This covenant is the covenant with Noah, and this is an unconditional promise. Some promises are conditional, some are unconditional. This unconditional promise is God says it's just not going to happen again. No matter what you do, no matter how you behave, it won't happen again. Later covenants do have some conditions attached to some of them. So on to a new chapter. The forefathers of God's people, which you might read in some of the textbooks described as the patriarchs. So it's this side of 2000 BCE, still in the Bible book of Genesis, key people like Abraham, who becomes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who becomes Israel, and Joseph. And we're going to look carefully as we go through the story at some different Israels so we'll understand which of these is which. Bottom right-hand corner of the map. And this is what happens. God makes promises to Abraham that he will be made a great nation. And the Hebrew, Avraham, means father of many. And Abraham travels all over the shop, from Ur to Israel, to Egypt to Israel, long way by camel. And God makes a covenant, a binding agreement, with Abraham, which is marked by circumcision. This is a conditional promise. God makes promises to Abraham's and his descendants that Abraham is going to be the father of many nations. But there are things that are required of God's people on their part. Consecration to God, and this is what circumcision symbolizes. So, Abraham's wife, Sarah, has a child called Isaac against all expectations in her old age. And the Bible story tells us that God tests Abraham by asking him to sacrifice this cherished son. If you look at Jerusalem looking down from the Mount of Olives, this is the view that we often get the news from. Very prominent in the old city is this gold dome, which is the Dome of the Rock. So it's a Muslim mosque. Inside is this giant slab of rock, which is believed to be the place where Abraham brought Isaac, was going to offer him in sacrifice, but as you may recall if you know the story, God provides a ram instead. This is Abraham's tomb, which is an interesting place to look at architecturally. It's in the West Bank, so it's in a difficult part of the world. And when you visit it, you find on the ground floor is a mosque, and on the upper floor is a synagogue. This is because our Jewish friends and our Muslim friends want to honor and remember Abraham as a prophet of God. So you see there the tomb, but you also sadly see immense military activity. The last time I was there were a dozen or so army vehicles outside. Isaac has sons called Esau and Jacob the younger son is the one who by deceit manages to obtain his father's blessing. Just a note while we think about blessing in the Bible stories, blessing is not just wishing somebody well. In Bible terms, blessing is something that you impart to somebody. And when it's given, you can't get it back. That's why the blessing of father to son in that story couldn't be undone. Oh, sorry, mistake, let's bless the right son. So next time somebody encourages you to pray for your Christian brothers or sisters and to bless them, understand that God puts into us the ability to impart and communicate good things to others. Jacob marries a lady called Rachel, and Jacob wrestles with God, and here is our first Israel. He gets a new name. Israel means he struggles with God. So the first Israel we track in the story of the Bible is an individual human being. Subsequently, we'll find two nations. And Israel has a favorite son. His name is Joseph. We could say we know a song about this, couldn't we? And Joseph is somebody who has a supernatural ability to explain dreams. And he's sold by his brothers to traders who are traveling to Egypt. And the end result of this is that Joseph, his remarkable gift results in being promoted by the Pharaoh to oversee all of Egypt. Eventually, after a famine, Jacob and his family settle in Egypt. Jacob and Joseph die. And that brings us to a new chapter. This chapter is the chapter of the suffering of God's people in Egypt. One of the most notoriously difficult things to actually date properly within the Bible story, because there is so little archaeological evidence, but maybe around the sort of 1400 BC time. In the Bible book of Exodus, which means departure or leaving, key people, Pharaoh, Moses, Aaron. There's Egypt for you, just in case you've lost it. And this is a time when Egypt is the dominant political force in the ancient world. The story is this. After the death of Joseph, the Pharaoh oppresses the Israelites into slavery. At the British Museum is this rather exciting brick. Well, I think it's exciting because it's got a seal on it from the Pharaoh Ramesses II, who possibly is the Pharaoh involved in the story. Despite an order from the Pharaoh that newborn Israelite children are all to be put to death, Moses survives. He's brought up in God's grace by his own mother as an adopted son of the Pharaoh's daughter. And Moses kills an Egyptian for beating a Hebrew and then flees to Midian. And in that situation, God, we are told, hears the groaning of his people in their situation of slavery, and God speaks to Moses through a burning bush. And this is when God says, "This is my name, I am who I am." And when the Bible talks about names, the Bible isn't talking simply about labels. It's not important to know which sequence of letters denotes the name of God. What is important is to know everything that he is, his person, his character, his authority. It's rather like, in a very dissimilar sort of way, my name, Mike Fuller, is the name that I'm known by, but if I were to write it upon a cheque, then it carries a different sort of significance. It has my authority to release whatever little funds might be in my bank account to somebody else. So God's name represents not just what you're going to call him, but it represents all that he is. Now, you might want to go and visit the burning bush, in which case next time you're in Egypt sunning yourself along the Red Sea, take a trip to St. Catherine's, which is in the bottom left-hand picture, and they will show you the burning bush because they've kept it and grown it, and they will tell you that this can't be transplanted, cuttings from it won't take anywhere else, it's the only one of its sort in the whole of Egypt. So there's your opportunity, go and visit it. God promises through Moses that his people will be rescued and they will have a land of their own. He commands Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. So Moses goes back to Egypt and with his brother Aaron confronts the Pharaoh. Who might be this guy? Ramesses II. If it is, it's interesting because he produced this stele, which is one of the earliest examples ever of political spin, though we'll see another before we're finished. And on this stele is one of the very, very few sort of ancient archaeological references to Hebrew people, where the Pharaoh says, there were some Hebrew people here, but we didn't have any trouble with them. They were all perfectly under control. Politicians from today take note. Despite Aaron's superior signs, with his staff becoming a snake and so on, the Pharaoh continually refuses to release the Israelites. Not even a sequence of plagues sent from God persuade the Pharaoh to let them go. God promises he's going to protect the Israelite people. He will pass over their homes, but strike down the firstborn of Egyptian people and animals. And this, of course, is the historical route to our Jewish friends' celebration of Passover, the passing over. Eventually, under this pressure, the Pharaoh urges the Israelites to go, but then he pursues them with an army to the Red Sea, where the Egyptian army perish. To a new chapter, from Egypt to the land that God has promised. Again, the timing of this is a tad tricky, but maybe around the 1300 BCE mark. Bible books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua, and key people involved in the story, Moses, Aaron, and Joshua. That's how you get from Egypt to the Promised Land. And this is an attempt by the scholars to do a map of the journey. Now, actually, if you were going to walk that distance, you could probably do it in about 10 days. So my personal theory is that it must have been planned by some sort of parish parochial council or a set of Baptist deacons, because in fact it takes them 40 years to do the journey, and you could put the squiggles anywhere you wanted and probably be right, and that's a rough idea of where they went. Okay, guys, so we have the wilderness journey, and it takes 40 years for God's people to do this, led by a pillar of cloud or fire. They're miraculously provided for with manna, and God reveals his ways of living with the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Now, this is fun as well. If you want to see Mount Sinai, when you're staying on the Red Sea coast, you take a coach at 10 o'clock at night, off into the desert for a few hours, and you arrive at the bottom of Mount Sinai when it's dark, and you walk up for about 6 or 7 kilometers. You might find you get tired if you're my age, so I stopped and rented a camel from a passing Bedouin. And then, in daylight, so you can see them, you come to 780 steps carved into the rock face. And then you get to the top just in time for sort of 5 o'clock in the morning to see the dawn over Sinai. Then you come down and have breakfast at St. Catherine's monastery. So God reveals his ways of living on Mount Sinai, and he also reveals many other laws, including how to worship, how to sacrifice, using the tabernacle, a portable worship center where the ark was placed. So here we see on the left-hand side a reconstruction, a model of that tabernacle. And the barbecue type thing is the place of offering and sacrifice. And the close-up on the right-hand side is the Ark of the Covenant, which lives inside the big tent that's in the background there. The laws that are given by God form a covenant agreement between God and Israel. And this then is the covenant at Sinai. This is a conditional promise made with the descendants of Abraham. And it works rather like the sort of deal that was made in ancient times between a rich and powerful king with a big army and a little tiny wimpy nation without much of an army. And the big nation would promise, we'll look after you and provide for you, but the little nation would have to promise, we will obey everything that you say. And this sort of covenant form, which is there in ancient literature, is the covenant form between God and his people. However, despite God's great goodness, the people of Israel grumble, complain, make a golden calf to worship, and Moses, as a result, never enters the land that God has promised. Under Joshua, the promised land is taken with a key initial victory that takes place at Jericho. Trumpet. And walls, okay. There was an archaeologist called Kathleen Kenyon a while ago, one of the first people, best part of 100 years ago, who excavated at Jericho. And she suggested, though the scholars debate it now, how interesting these walls seem to have fallen outwards, not inwards into the city. Because you'd expect an approaching army to sort of push the walls down. But maybe the Bible's true, and God did it. When the land has been successfully conquered, different territories are allocated to the 12 tribes. You have to turn your head to one side to get this. North is to the right, but that's a sort of rough breakdown of the tribes. And just to get you orientated again, that's Israel, the right way up. God's people affirm again their covenant relationship with God at Shechem. Joshua himself dies. And now we come to another chapter. The chapter of God's people living in the land under the rule of the judges. This is around the 11, 12, 1300 BC sort of a mark. Bible books of Judges and Ruth, key people, Deborah, Gideon, Samson and Ruth. And there it is, the right-hand side, that's where Israel is. And what is happening is that local tribes in this period of time are being conquered by the people of Israel as they take the land. So what happens is this. For about 300 years, God's people live in the land under judges or local rulers. And there's an interesting recurring cycle through this history period of God's people being disobedient, a resulting foreign oppression by other forces. God's people then cry out to God in distress and ask for God's deliverance. It's also a cycle that you might be familiar with in your own life, because we tend to disobey, to suffer an oppression as a result, and then to cry to God and ask him to save us. And thankfully, he is a God who does this. This is the time in history where we encounter Philistines. This is a Philistine warrior that we can see at the British Museum. This is the time when Deborah defeats Canaan, Gideon defeats Midian, Samson fights the Philistines, but sadly is betrayed by Delilah. And against this background comes the story of Ruth, David's great-grandmother. And then we come to a new chapter, and it's quite a decisive one for the unfolding story of the Bible. This is a chapter in which God's people choose to be ruled by kings. Up to now, the deal is that God is sort of dealing direct and the priests are involved. So this happens just this side of the 1000 BCE mark. Bible books, a whole load of them, because now we're getting a lot of historical writing, and also the writings, which we'll mention in a moment, key people: Samuel, Saul, David, Jonathan, Goliath, Nathan, Solomon. And this is a time, rule-wise, of Israel being established in this season as the most powerful political force of the time. First, baby Samuel is born to Hannah, who up to this time has been infertile. And Samuel is trained by the priest Eli. The Ark of the Covenant is lost to the Philistines, who then find it's not such a good thing to have it around, and they return it. And God gives a call to Samuel, who is a judge, to anoint Saul to be a king. And critically in the Bible story, it says Israel wants to have a king like the other nations. But the Bible writer is very clear that this was not a good thing to do. This brings all sorts of hassle. After Saul's disobedience as a king, he's rejected by God, and Samuel is instructed instead to anoint David. David emerges as a hero after he's killed Goliath. This beautiful valley of Elah, is close to Bethlehem. And Saul, so the king, becomes insanely jealous and there are Bible stories of him trying to kill David. One of the lovely ones takes place in Ein Gedi on the edge of the Dead Sea, still inhabited by rather nice little goats, and a place where people will sometimes drive down from Jerusalem to splash around in the waters of the oasis. And the Bible story tells us that David is hiding from Saul. Saul is trying to kill David, and David's hiding in a cave, and the Bible story tells us that Saul goes, if you read one of the American translations, into the cave to use the bathroom, which always struck me as rather fun. And as he goes to the bathroom, David snips off a bit of his cloak, and then when Saul has gone out again, David can say, hey, look, really, I don't want to kill you. So this is the persecution of David, but after Saul's death, David becomes king, and David is very special because he is the one who conquers Jerusalem. This model in Jerusalem shows the old city of David. And if we look at the map that we've seen before, looking down at Jerusalem from the top of the Mount of Olives, over on the left-hand side is a slope that goes up towards where you now find the walled city as it is today. And the old city of Jerusalem was down on that slope, which may make sense for you when you read Psalms that say, let us go up to the temple, because the city was down on the slope and the palace and so on, and the temple at the top, eventually to be on the site where we've seen the Dome of the Rock Mosque. That involves an uphill journey. And in recent years, they have now actually begun to find and excavate the ancient city of David that can be visited today. David is successful in expanding Israel's territory, in establishing Jerusalem. He's a prolific songwriter, and it's his desire to build a temple in Jerusalem. But also David shows weakness, committing adultery with Bathsheba, and then arranging her husband's accidental death in battle. But the Bible remembers him as an ideal king. And again, as a footnote, when you trace through the Bible and you find stories of significant people used by God, actually, like us, they all have their quite significant areas of vulnerability and weakness. But God is concerned with the heart rather than keeping a tick record of all the wrong things that have been done. So God, loving David and his faithfulness, promises that David's dynasty will last forever. The covenant with David, and this is an unconditional promise. There is nothing that people will have to do. God simply says the Davidic dynasty will continue. There will always be a godly king like David. Now, this, of course, created problems for the people of Israel when they eventually lost their land. But from the perspective of faith in Christ, we see that that dynasty actually continues through time in Jesus, who is from David's line. David's son, Solomon, further extends Israel's military, political, and commercial influence, and it's Solomon who actually does the building to build the temple that his father had dreamed of. So this is a model from the Bible Museum in Amsterdam, and this is known, just to be technical, as the first temple, because it's the first temple. And we'll distinguish that later from the second temple that comes after the exile. And our Jewish friends today refer to our current season of time as the season of the third temple, though there is no physical temple to be seen. Solomon's era is marked by wisdom and also by the emergence of a new sort of writing, how to live in the world. These are books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, and Job. Solomon also demonstrates weakness, quite significant weakness. He's judged at the end of his life to be a bad king because he permits extensive pagan worship influenced by his significant number of pagan wives. So Solomon has flouted the covenant agreement with God. And as the story of the kings continues, this failure of God's people who have chosen to live under kings, to live in a right relationship with God, is beginning to build up its own consequence. The land then, new chapter, is divided, 950-something, and this divided land runs through until the time of exile, which begins in 721 BCE. Bible books of Kings and Chronicles, and also prophetic books, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, and Jonah. Some key kings and prophets, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, Ahab, Jezebel, Elijah, Elisha, Uzziah, and Isaiah. We're still in that same patch of land, but now we have separate kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Because after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam's insensitive leadership prompts a division between the north, Israel, and the south, Judah. We've got Israel the person, then we have got Israel the nation, and now we have Israel, which is part of God's territory of land, the northern part ruled from Samaria. And this division runs for about 200 years. So Israel has the greater part of the territory, but as the Bible writers tell us the story, Judah has the greater part of the honor. As the Bible story unfolds, kings are assessed on their obedience to the covenant between God and his people. In the south, Judah, kings are comparatively well behaved, but in the north there's serious corruption, for example, with Ahab and Jezebel. And in this time there emerge prophets like Elijah and Elisha who challenge the wrong, particularly of the north, but the south as well. Writing prophets emerge, like Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah, and they condemn in their writing they're writing prophetic things. Earlier, people said prophetic things and they got put into books, but now collections are made of their prophetic utterances. And these writing prophets condemn God's people's social injustice, condemn their covenant disobedience, and warn that bad things will happen, but sadly God's people won't listen. And the result of this is this new chapter, that God's people are driven out of the land that God has given to them. This is known as the exile, and it happens in two chunks, sort of north first and then south. So, Bible books, loads of them, historic and prophetic, key people, Isaiah, Hezekiah, Jeremiah, Josiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, those prophets then seeing us through to the sort of exile period of time. And what is going to happen is God's people are going to be shifted eastward to the nations that rule over them. In this season, Assyria and then Babylon, we're talking about ancient kingdoms in the sort of Iraq area, they have become the dominant political force of the age, and they want to take over every bit of land that there is. So God allows his disobedient people to be punished and to lose their land. Remember, the giving of the land was not an unconditional promise. God's people had to obey what they were told to do in order to live there. The prophets warn of what's going to come, but they're not heeded. The power of Assyria grows. In 841 BCE, Jehu, a king of Israel, pays tribute to the king Shalmaneser. There's a whopping great black stone thing in the British Museum that marks that out. Eventually, first the north falls to Assyria in 722, and the people are exiled, while to the south, Judah for a while is spared. Here's another example of political spin. Sennacherib, the king by this stage, says on this little stone doofer, which is only about that big, he says, "I caged up Hezekiah and all his people like a caged bird in the city of Jerusalem." What he doesn't mention, but the Bible tells us, is he hears rumors of trouble at home, turns the army around and goes back, and Judah and Jerusalem for a while are spared. So they try and consolidate Jerusalem, make it better defended and safer, and the king Hezekiah carves a tunnel to provide a water supply for the city, which you can still walk through. It's 538 meters long, and a magnificent bit of engineering. They actually tunneled from two directions and met about 4 centimeters out when they got there in the middle. Josiah attempts a sort of reformation. God's commands and law are found again in 640 BCE, but the Bible picture is that the momentum towards destruction is so great that actually suffering is going to come. And finally, the south falls to Babylon in 586. It's no longer Assyria, now it's Babylon. And they had a neat way as a conquering army of dealing with people then. What they did was, instead of saying, right, we're going to occupy your land while you know where you can hide and you can do a fine bit of resistance against us, they said, oh no, we've got a better way than that. They would take a whole people to another land that they had conquered, or to their own land, so that those people taken away in slavery would not have the advantage of knowing the lie of the land and being in their own place. So God's people from the south, from Judah, are taken to Babylon. All of Jerusalem, including Solomon's temple, is destroyed. The Ark of the Covenant is lost until Indiana Jones finds it some little while later on, and the people are exiled into Babylon. From that time until 1948, the people of Israel have no land of their own, which of course is why they're so passionate about celebrating their land now. The prophets begin to anticipate that God will restore his rule through a coming anointed one. This is an unconditional promise that will enable unfaithful Israel to be forgiven of all the wrong things that she has done. And the prophet Jeremiah says this time God's law won't be written on tablets of stone, but will be written onto people's hearts. So there's this coming hope. And those of you who are in midlife crisis or into retro music may remember that Boney M did a recording of Psalm 137 in which it says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? A psalm from that time. But in God's great mercy, the people returned to the land, starting in about 521. Bible books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and so on. Key people, Cyrus, a king, Ezra, Haggai, Nehemiah, Esther, and Zechariah, returning from the east to the west. And this is a time when Persia is ruling. The king, Cyrus, is a very sort of kind and generous ruler. And often in those days, people would not allow anyone to worship their own God. They would have to worship the god or gods of the conquering nation. But Cyrus is famous because he actually sent an edict out, and some of it's recorded on this rather dinky little thing called the Cyrus cylinder, which you can see at the British Museum, saying that people in their own lands could worship their own gods. The Cyrus cylinder doesn't mention God's people going back to Israel, but it does confirm this political decision that he made. So, a first group of God's people return. They start the process of reconstruction. After a period of opposition, the temple is rebuilt and is dedicated the second temple, because it comes after the first, following the same basic blueprint and design with a few extra sort of twiddly bits added. And the second temple is the one that then runs on in and will become the temple that Jesus visits with some extra sophistication added to it by Herod. Nehemiah oversees the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. This is when the book of Esther is set. And while God's people have returned to their own land, they are now ruled by another nation. And again, it will be until 1948 before they're able to have a land which is truly their own. The prophets encourage a faithful waiting for God to fulfill all of his promises. And that takes us out of the Old Testament and on into the New. Though we'll note a couple of things in the period between the Old and the New Testaments. This is when, a little while before Jesus, Dead Sea Scrolls were written. These were found in caves at Qumran in jars like the jar pictured on the right-hand side there. Shepherd lad chucking rocks, chucks one into a cave, finds inside there are these jars with ancient scrolls in. And what is wonderful about these scrolls for our understanding of the Bible is that there are there Bible scrolls for Bible books that are 1,000 years older than any scrolls or texts that we had up until the time when they were found. And so the scholars now take a great deal of effort to compare those ancient scrolls with the text as it was handed down. And the end result is this, that the authenticity, the accuracy of passing down those Bible books is extraordinarily good. There is no significant difference in terms of history or doctrine with that 1,000-year period showing how well things were passed down. Another key thing that happens is what is called Herod's temple, but can be confusing, because that is the second temple you saw a while ago. But what Herod decides is, having this on top of a hill isn't so good. He thinks we need a big flat space that everyone can gather on if needs be. So he does enormous building work to put a sort of buttressing wall up around the outside of the second temple, which then allows a completely flat horizontal area there. There is an ancient helicopter photograph also. And down underneath today, you can go through the tunnels along these foundation walls. In the left-hand picture, if you want to know what a cornerstone looks like in Bible thinking, there's one at the bottom of that pile of stuff. Weighs something like 3-4 heffalumps. It's a magnificent bit of stone. And I took that photograph sort of looking sideways because the quality of building is so amazing. Because they didn't have cranes. But what they did was they put one rock onto the rock below, and they used lead ball bearings. so that they could roll the piece of rock to its exact place, and then over a period of a few days, the lead, because it was soft, would give way, and so the rocks could be in precisely the right place, as a 2-centimetre step as they go up. And so we come to Jesus. That's good. I like it when we get to Jesus. The time would probably have been a little bit before the 0 mark, because the nice monk who calculated it all made a small error. Bible books of Matthew and Luke, key people, Joseph, Mary, shepherds, kings, and Herod. There is Israel, bottom right, under the rule, politically, of Rome. Just so you can see which bit is which, Nazareth is in the north, Jerusalem further south, and bottom of those yellow dots is Bethlehem, about the distance from the north of Wales to the south of Wales. So, 3 or 4 days walk, and not easy to do if you're pregnant and travelling by donkey. So, to understand a bit about the setting there, across to our correspondent in Bethlehem. The story of Jesus begins here in Bethlehem at the Church of the Nativity. Not, of course, within the church itself, but underneath in a network of caves where Jesus is believed to have been born. The promise of Jesus' birth foretold in Nazareth, celebrated at a place called Ein Karim with Elizabeth close to Jerusalem, explained to Joseph, which is a bit of a tricky problem, and then takes place in Bethlehem, and this is the Church of the Nativity. And beneath the Church of the Nativity is a network of ancient caves. Very probably the home would have been a home where the cave behind and below was where the animals were kept, and this was the place where Mary was allowed to give birth to Jesus. Tradition tells us, not actually on this rather ornate silver star surrounded by incense, but in a place which has been marked for us in that way. The birth of Jesus witnessed by shepherds and wise men, and resented by Herod who actually kills a whole load of babies. If you go just a few miles away from Bethlehem, this man-made mountain is a magnificent palace that Herod built and called it Herodion. And this palace marked his splendor. He built other palaces all over the shop in Caesarea and in Jerusalem itself. And because he was so concerned about the protection of his own political importance, he is the one who instructs the killing of babies, but Jesus, by God's grace, is preserved. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus spend some time as refugees in Egypt, then return to their home in Nazareth. The only bit of Jesus' life that we read about in the Bible, from birth to adulthood, the only space in between is as a boy of 12 when he goes to the temple in Jerusalem. And so the chapter of the start of Jesus' ministry, 20-something-ish CE, in the Bible books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Key people, Jesus, John the Baptist, disciples, Mary, Pharisees, and crowds. That's Israel, still in the same place, still under the rule of Rome. The story goes like this. At the outset of his ministry, Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. We do have an alternative Anglican option. It depends how much water you're going to use. So, Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. He's tempted by the devil. We're not quite sure where. And then he goes to the temple, clears the temple. His first miracle, John tells us, happens at Cana. There is opposition in his hometown of Nazareth. This precipice on a mountaintop, we're told by tradition, is the place where Jesus was herded out by people wanting to harm him. But by God's grace, he walks through free from them. Jesus calls disciples to follow him. And so we come to the chapter of 3 years of preaching and training. 4 Bible books, key people, Jesus, disciples, Pharisees, and so on. Starting around the beautiful Lake of Galilee to the north of the country. This synagogue is a 3rd century synagogue, but built on the foundations of the time of Jesus. And just across the city, the ancient town rather, of Capernaum, are these foundations held by tradition to be Peter's house. So you can imagine at the beginning of Mark, Jesus coming from the encounter with a demonized man in the synagogue and over to Peter's mother-in-law's house. And these traditions are quite strong traditions because after Constantine, the Roman emperor, became a Christian, Helena travelled to the Holy Land, researched all these places. So about 300 years after the time of Jesus is the origin of the traditions for building churches like the one that is now over the alleged house of Peter. Jesus proclaims publicly that God's kingdom has come. This is the place where the Sermon on the Mount is believed to have been taught, so there is private training on how to be a follower. Many tourists go to the top where there's a beautiful church. When I go there, I like to take people around the side of the church, because down on the edge of the hill is a beautiful natural amphitheatre where you could imagine Jesus preaching to thousands of people. And that is a lovely place to take a group of pilgrims and celebrate communion and remember what our Lord did in his teaching there. His teaching, of course, can make your brain hurt. Jesus taught that the kingdom had already arrived, that the kingdom had come very close, that the kingdom was invaluable, invisible, and highly influential, and he taught that the kingdom would also come at some stage in the future, and for good measure taught us to pray that the kingdom would come. And this can often make us, as we study the Bible, a bit confused about the kingdom here, close, future, and to be prayed for. Derek Morphew's wonderful book, Breakthrough, helps us to understand this. And the key is that God's kingdom is not, as we are inclined to think, a geographically defined area. God's kingdom is God's rule. So when God's kingdom has come close in Jesus, the rule of God is physically standing there in front of you. When you are considering whether to enter into this kingdom life, the kingdom is there within reach for you to grasp and accept. But that kingdom has yet to be completely fulfilled so that all of creation comes under God's rule. So we look for the time in the future when the kingdom will be fulfilled, and we pray when we say the Lord's Prayer, "May your kingdom come on earth as in heaven." As Jesus travels around, he works many healings and miracles. This is the pool at Bethesda in Jerusalem. Some 19th century critics said, well, that story was clearly made up because we can't find any archaeological evidence of a pool of Bethesda. Then they found it. So again, Bible 1, critics nil. The disciples are sent out with good news. There is growing opposition from the religious establishment. Peter, up in Caesarea Philippi, recognizes Jesus as the anointed one, as the Christ. And this then acts as a sort of pivotal point in the New Testament story. Up until this time, Jesus has kept who he is rather quiet. But then he starts to talk about his own suffering and death and resurrection and sets out towards Jerusalem. As he goes down through Jericho, which is fairly close to Jerusalem. That's where he meets Zacchaeus up a tree. And when I was there last, they did tell me, this is the tree. And the notice by it tells you, this is a very old tree. So there you are, you've seen the tree. They go round through Bethany, where Lazarus has died. Lazarus is raised from death. That's why his tomb there is empty. Because history builds up layers of sediment, of course, you go down quite a long way now to find that tomb. And we come to the last week in Jerusalem. Let's set a little bit of background. This fantastic model, those are real people on the right-hand side, has been made at the Israel Museum to show what Jerusalem looked like in the 1st century CE. So we're looking down from the Mount of Olives, the same perspective as before. That is the beautiful gate, the gate called Beautiful, because when you went through it, you saw the beauty of the temple. One of the possible sites for Caiaphas' house, we'll look at two of them, is over on the left-hand side where the number 3 is. This will be the place where Peter denies Jesus and the cock crows. When Jesus is taken before Pilate, the Romans, with the sensitivity for which they were famed, built a giant barracks next to the temple where the number 4 is, called the Antonia Fortress. So they didn't have to go into the temple, which would create problems. They could watch everything that went on there. And from there, Jesus is taken to his death, either the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or Gordon's Calvary. So those are the perspectives. Jesus has a rapturous welcome on Palm Sunday, with people hoping he might be coming to set them free politically. He comes into the city and again clears the temple. The Last Supper is celebrated possibly in St. Mark's Church here. This is said to be a site for the upper room. It's certainly very ancient, now underground. And there's a lovely lady who looks after it, who, if you ask her very nicely when you visit, will sing you the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic, which is a nice thing to do. Then Jesus goes out from the Last Supper to Gethsemane to pray, knowing what is going to happen. The olive trees were destroyed by the Romans when they destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE. But the root systems of olive trees continue. So those trees where you go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, are the sort of great-great-grandchildren of the trees that were there when Jesus went out and prayed. Jesus is arrested, falsely tried, sentenced to death. So he's taken on this path across the Kidron Valley, possibly to this site for Caiaphas' house. If so, we can say Jesus walked up these steps. And here is the holding cell beneath that place. It's called the Church of Peter in Gallicantu. This would be a holding cell underneath for prisoners being kept by a priest. That's one priestly house. Closer to the western wall in Jerusalem has now been excavated this site, which is called the Burnt House. That site also is the site, apparently, of a priestly family. Some people have begun to argue that might be the place. Jesus is taken to the Antonia fortress, and these stones, no longer in their original place, are stones from the courtyard. And the archaeologists tell us that that engraving on them, the circle there, represents a crown because of the Roman soldiers' habit of mocking the people who were their captives and pretending that they were kings. Welcome to the city of Jerusalem, a city important to Jewish, Christian and Muslim faith. For many Christians, this church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, marks the place where Jesus died and came back to life. Other Christians think this might be the place, the Garden Tomb. It's certainly possible, and at the very least it does help us to understand better what the tomb of Jesus would have looked like then. It is hard to choose between the two sites. Probably the greater historical support would go for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but when you visit Jerusalem, the Garden Tomb and Gordon's Calvary there have got a strong argument for them, and I know whenever I go there and sit and pray there, I meet the risen Lord Jesus there. So Jesus finally is executed by torture, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the place where it is believed that he died, where when you go you find pilgrims putting their hand into what is said to be the place in the rock that supported the cross. And that appeared to be the end of the story. And thankfully we know that was not the case, because now we come to the chapter of resurrection. Wonderful, wonderful. Here is the Garden Tomb. And when you go into this ancient tomb, which has, as I say, quite a lot to commend it, you look inside, you find a place for a body, with space for angels, with a wall that's not finished, with the place for a rolling stone at the front. You find somewhere that shows us where Jesus' body was laid, the likeness, if not the historical truth. When you look on the door of the Garden Tomb, it says, "He is not here, for he is risen." In this chapter, Jesus, over a period of weeks, appears alive to many. He teaches them more about the kingdom of God. He directs the disciples to wait in Jerusalem, where the Spirit will come to them. These are two modern things that mark resurrection appearances of Jesus up by the Sea of Galilee. And then after 40 days, Jesus ascends to heaven, his resurrection period on earth being marked by that. And we come to the birth of the church, the Bible book of Acts, the apostles and Stephen. What happens is this: the Holy Spirit's fire falls at Pentecost. Different explanations of where it might have been. This is a model of the temple in Jerusalem in Jesus' time, and you can see there's a sort of two-story bit in the background there. Some people think that might be where the disciples were meeting, in the upper rooms of that bit of the building. Or if you go about 100 yards further back, remember I told you about St. Mark's Church and its upper room. Some people think perhaps it could have been there. You could get 120 in there at a push. There are other possible places as well. There is faithful preaching of the good news. 3,000 are converted. There are many signs and wonders. Religious opposition continues, but there is renewed fervour to proclaim the good news. There's opposition when Stephen is martyred, a great persecution with the church scattered through Judea and Samaria. Now we have the new covenant. Now I'm going to be sort of tricky and say it is a conditional, unconditional promise to welcome home all humankind. I say it for these reasons: that God has said to us he will deal with the problem of sin that each human being has. He will provide his Spirit living within our hearts. And this is an unconditional promise in that there is not a certain standard we have to achieve in order to get that. It's not a reward, it's a gift of God's great grace. But the conditional dimension is simply this. God says to us, we need to recognize our own situation, our own need, receive this gift of forgiveness that he offers to us, and then live on in relationship with him. So the flame of the new church spreads. Samaritans are converted. They're important because they're sort of half Jew and half not. The Ethiopian official takes the good news back to Africa. Saul, who becomes Paul, encounters Jesus on the Damascus road. Peter is compelled by God as he encounters God in a vision to accept those who are not Jews directly into the church without becoming Jews en route to becoming Christians. Non-Jews, Gentiles, are converted, filled with the Spirit and baptized, and the church expands across the known world. The Spirit sends Paul and Barnabas out. If you want to know, where you get your program for mission from, the Bible is very clear. The Holy Spirit is the director of mission. And so Paul goes out on different journeys to proclaim Christ. Local opposition fails to deter. The church makes a formal decision that you don't have to become a Jew before you become a Christian. Mission and church planting journeys follow. And so Paul goes to Philippi, and there in the market space encounters this demon-affected girl, and she's set free. He's put in prison and he's released. Paul goes to Athens, and on the place for philosophical speaking at the Areopagus, he talks about the one God that you have not encountered within the many gods of the nation. He goes and spends some time working in Corinth. From this picture across to the left is what was the street of the tent makers, which was Paul's job. And when you look at it, you can actually find the tents that he made were often like an awning on a caravan. They were to go in the front of a shop. And in the stone, you can still find little places where there's been a sort of hollowed out bit of the ground rock to tie the tents. So Paul worked there, and he worked there in the shadow of that massive mountain which is called the Acrocorinth, on the top of which was extensive and frequent ritual prostitution, both of men offered and women offered. So Paul would have seen every day people heading up that mountain for unhelpful sexual relationships, looking for help from gods who in reality were not there. That might help you to understand why sometimes the people in Corinth were in a bit of a moral mess. Paul goes on to Ephesus, and this is the amphitheatre in Ephesus, now in Turkey. The amphitheatre where there's the riot because people are concerned about their trade, making models of a goddess. And those journeys continue, and the churches are overseen by travelling leaders and by letter. Where perversions of the good news emerge, they're countered by the apostles. Paul is arrested and takes the opportunity to travel to Rome to proclaim Christ there. The picture on the right shows the view today across the Forum in Rome. And if you were to look back over your left-hand shoulder, this church is built over what was the Mamertine prison in the time of Paul. And this is the prison, we believe, where both Paul and on a different occasion Peter were kept. You can now go down steps to visit it, but you can see at the top of the picture the hole in the ceiling that in those days you would have been dropped through. Then, AD 70, the temple is destroyed. You may sometimes have wondered, why did Jewish people treasure the Western Wall, part of the temple, when Jesus said not one stone would be left upon another? The answer is very simple. The temple was completely destroyed, but when Herod built his big flat bit around the temple, he built a massive supporting buttress wall to hold it all in place. So this wall here is what is left of the sort of surrounding foundation of the temple. Jesus would have walked by it and seen it. And when Jerusalem is destroyed, and you can go now to places where the stones are where they actually landed, everything was pulled down. Jewish people, in fact, won't go up onto the top of the mount in case they accidentally walk across the area of the Holy of Holies. But in the tunnels there a while ago, I met this lovely Jewish lady who had worked out this was the nearest place to the Holy of Holies where she could stop and sit and pray. You may not know that the Colosseum in Rome used to be covered by all sorts of precious metals and so on. And when Jerusalem was destroyed, all of the wealth from the temple was taken to put decorations there onto the Colosseum. On the bottom left picture is the arch built by the Roman emperor who oversaw that, and in the detail inside that arch are Roman soldiers carrying away as booty the giant candlestick that was in the Jerusalem temple. So to the last chapter. Persecution and a glimpse of the end. This monastery on the island of Patmos, sort of off the coast away from Ephesus, is where John encounters the risen Lord Jesus. John speaks encouragement, challenge and correction to local church congregations. In powerful visionary images, John sees the unfolding drama of the coming end time. Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. That was the entire story of the Bible in pretty darn close to 50 minutes. Thank you.